Okay, we might, in the interest of time, make a start. And so welcome everybody. My name is Bianca Bridgenath, and I'm really excited today to be here to chair the NARI Seminars in Aging series. Thank you to my colleague Jess Cecil for giving me the opportunity to chair the session today. I'm really excited to do that because we've got a fantastic speaker, Dr. Earvin Charles Cabalquinto, joining us. But before I introduce Dr. Cabalquinto, I would like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which each of us are meeting today. And for me, that is the Wurundjeri Woiwurrung people. And I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands and waters across Australia as well. And I pay my respects to elders past and present, and to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, including members of the stolen generation. First, a little bit of housekeeping about Zoom. We'll have the talk, and at the conclusion of it, we'll have some time for Q&A. If you have any questions during the talk, you can submit them through the seminar using the chat function, which can be opened using the chat tab at the bottom of your screen. Today's seminar will be recorded and uploaded to our website within a few days, so please keep that in mind. If you turn on your video to ask a question, that your image will be included in this recording. In the event also that you have colleagues who are not able to be here today, but you think they would really benefit from this talk, keep in mind the talk will be available and you can share that resource with them as well. So today we're going to be hearing from Dr. Earvin Charles Cabalquinto. Dr. Cabalquinto is a lecturer in communication digital media at Deakin University. He is a member of the Alfred Deakin Institute for Citizenship and Globalization, and he is an honorary visiting fellow in the Humanities Research Centre at the Australian National University. His research works are situated within the intersecting fields of digital media, mobilities, and migration research. He has published extensively in top-tier international journals and edited book collections. He's the author of Immobile Homes, Family Life at a Distance in the Age of Mobile Media, published as part of the Studies in Mobile Communication series of Oxford University Press. He sits on the editorial board of the International Journal of Cultural Studies, and he is also the social media editor of the Asian Journal of Communication. And if you want to know more about his work, you can visit his website, which is www.ecabalquinto.com. So we're really excited to have Earvin here today and to present to us, and over to you.
Thank you very much, Bianca. And thank you very much for inviting me to present here in the National Research Institute for Aging People, and also for really understanding the role of digital media technologies in shaping the experiences of aging migrants, particularly during the pandemic. And that's what I'm presenting today. And my presentation today is titled Feeling Close from Afar, the Digital Repertoires of Aging Migrants During the Pandemic. So I'll be actually using Lego to visualize some of the stories of the participants in my research, and I'm also using Lego to articulate that visualization of how we might think about kind of like digital media practices and also the entangled affective dimensions of the use of technologies during the pandemic. And it's creating that sense of proximity despite the physical distance. Okay, so today's presentation is basically kind of like really unpacking some of the important parts of kind of like my research. I'll just stop sharing my screen first and then reshare it again because I think it's not working, but hopefully this will work. It's just unpacking some of the interesting parts of kind of like understanding how aging migrants would be using digital technologies. So my research inquiry for this research, I'm interested in looking at the role of digital media and online channels in shaping the experiences of navigating a lockdown in Victoria, Australia. As we know that Victoria had a series of lockdowns and kind of like impacting different individuals, family members, and also institutions. But I'm also thinking about the social and technological factors that's influencing the use and non-use of digital technologies. But more than that, I want to unpack the benefits, but also the limits of digital media use during and beyond pandemic times, and building on this inquiry and how what we might think about kind of like the learnings or the information that we receive from research to move forward and rethink digital divide in our society. So the first framework that I'm actually using for this research is this digital repertoire perspective by my colleagues from Finland. And they're highlighting that digital repertoire would be illustrating the purpose, perception, and use of mobile devices as shaped by physical, social, technological, and contextual factors. So this perspective is very kind of like relevant in terms of moving away from that technological determinist perspective, wherein technology is the only factor or the only dimension kind of like shaping digital media use. But in this perspective, we're looking at the broader picture of the different factors that might be shaping digital media use and non-use. And that perspective of the digital repertoire is building on the media repertoire by Haysbrink and Pop. So kind of like looking at collection of communication channels and identifiable routines for specific communication purposes. But their study looked at the context of a workplace and the use of technologies in that space. Rather, with the work of my colleagues from Finland, Sakari and Rita, they're looking at the use of digital technologies by migrants, not aging migrants, but migrants. And they're arguing that we need to unpack this heterogeneous digital practices of older adults, and that heterogeneity kind of like be contextualized in the context of obviously the crisis, like in my research with the COVID-19 and its impact in digital media practices. So looking at that perspective of digital repertoire, I'm also looking at the movements and stasis within the digital environment. And to unpack that kind of like approach, I'm using the mobilities perspective, which I have been working on for the past years with my research and understanding how digital technologies are shaping our sense of movements, but also the sense of immobility. And with the mobilities perspective by Earvin, we are invited to think about the corporeal and non-corporeal movements impacted by different forms of communication and transport systems. And there's an entanglement in this space, like when we're using smartphones or social media channels, we're actually facilitated to use these technologies and be able to move virtually in a digital environment. But in order to move virtually, we need that material technology to help us do that. And obviously for Earvin, we need to unpack that there's a kind of like hierarchy and a nuanced perspective on the differences of digital media use. For example, in the mobilities perspective, wherein we have different network capital. And this would be including communication systems. It could be social networks that we have, a safe environment where we can access technologies or be able to move or be able to stay put safely, and the time to organize and utilize resources. So obviously, again, this is very kind of like looking at the broader picture on how practices are shaped in the everyday conditions of an individual. And with that understanding, we kind of like look at the differential and hierarchical movements or the politics of mobility. And this is highlighted, I think, during the pandemic, wherein it's a question of who was able to move virtually smoothly, and then who were able to kind of like be stuck in the digital environment because of the lack of access, competencies, and even the support networks to help the use of technologies to enable connectedness at a distance. Okay, so during the pandemic, there's a kind of like emerging studies, a lot actually, even before that, kind of like looking at immobilities in the migration context. So a bit of background about myself, I do research on digital media and migration and mobilities. And I'm particularly paying attention before in the mobilities, but now I'm looking at immobilities in the digital environment. So during the pandemic, and even up to now, we can see it. There's a conversation about the mobility gap, the question of like who is able to move smoothly, swiftly, safely through socioeconomic factors, geographical locations, cultural imperatives, and political circumstances. In this inquiry, we're actually invited to think about the migration regimes shaping the movements of refugees, asylum seekers, business elites, international students. So that's a conversation before the pandemic. But then during the pandemic, there is this concept of the immobility turn. We are now invited to pay attention to how immobilities are constructed by everyday mobility, border crossings at multiple scales, or even like migration regimes. But there's a gap. And the gap in that context, like we look at the pandemic, people were, stuck in their homes, staying put in their homes. They were following stay-at-home orders. But there's a gap wherein thinking about the role of digital media in shaping the experiences of being stuck at home physically, but perhaps not stuck virtually if you're able to access platforms, if you're able to use smartphones, or you're able to use all of these networks around you that can teach you and assist you to use those technologies to be able to move virtually. So somehow, the physical immobility created by lockdowns, cross-border shutdowns, or international travel restrictions were kind of like shaped by digital media use, and also enable that sense of local and transnational connections, especially for migrants and aging migrants more specifically. So in that sense, we kind of like think about that we have the mobilities, the virtual mobilities created by digital technologies, but at the same time, there's also this immobility happening in the digital world, and that's facilitated by either, I would be arguing, voluntary or involuntary. The voluntary is that we are actually thinking about not, for example, sharing information to our family members to hurt their feelings, or not showing how we're suffering here in Australia, or sometimes family members back home not sharing information to make sure that the family member here is not feeling anxious about the condition. So there's a kind of like negotiation or kind of like careful curation of information and communication in that space. But there's also involuntary. These are actually forced. These are forced in the sense that perhaps there's a disruption of the internet, there's no electricity somewhere, which I'll be talking about in my data, and you don't have the network to assist you to troubleshoot a particular technology or a platform in using that. So as we can see in here, it's not only about the movements in the digital environment that's highlighted by, the media allowing us to stay connected, and even the platforms, kind of like talking about stay at home, learn with me, cook with me with YouTube and, Instagram, stay at home, the stickers and stuff. But it's also about the immobilities happening in that space that can be voluntary, but also involuntary. And I would be arguing that this would be resource-based. Okay, so thinking about mobility and immobility, we should not think about these concepts as separated, but rather relational. They're very interconnected, intertwined. For example, when you look at the pandemic, in terms of like the physical mobility or immobility, people who were actually in a safe environment, like for example, the elites, those who were able to enclave themselves in safe environments, were actually relying to, they're immobile, physically immobile, so meaning less mobility because they're constrained in that space. But they're actually relying to the mobility of others to deliver food for them, to do shopping for them, to do all of these needs that they kind of like need to access, or goods and services they need to access, and being able to access that through the mobility of others. And that's interesting because this is a kind of like interconnectedness. However, for those who are actually struggling at home and kind of like relying to the immobility of or mobility of others, it's also interesting because they might not have the resources as opposed to someone who might probably rich or having access to resources and technologies, enabling that smooth physical immobility, but even like kind of like smooth virtual mobility because of that knowledge and competencies and access to technologies. But then at the same time, you're actually relying on someone's mobility or immobility in that space to enact your everyday practices. And that's a point of, for example, with Salazar, which I'm building on, this idea that immobility now became the good default thing to do as a responsible citizen during the pandemic. People did not become totally immobile. So I was saying limited mobilities with immobility, right? But their usual patterns of immobility and the valorization of mobility and mobility were reconfigured. So we're looking at the pandemic, we're in a question of like, who is able to be immobile? And that's actually great. But it's also a question, because they're immobile, they're able to have access to resources and other networks that will allow them to stay put, while the hyper-mobile, for example, nurses, delivery drivers, delivery people would be running things for them to ensure their safety. So we can see this social kind of like structural inequalities as well in that space. And also when you look at the digital media platforms, so you're able to be immobile at home virtually, perhaps with the technology, or rather virtually mobile, but then you also have these platforms generating all of this data, but then immobilizing that hierarchy in our society because they're extracting data and turning the data into more profit, even though we're not moving a lot but we are relying on technologies. So with my research, I actually been thinking about looking at the case of older adults from culturally and linguistically diverse backgrounds using mobile devices and online channels for civic participation. Just to flag in, I think Ruth is here. Good to see you, Ruth. So she's in the presentation today. So I'm also looking at the works of Ruth and some of the great scholars working on, and even Bianca on looking at Baldassar and Wilding, looking at the cases of older migrants and the way they use technologies for connections. But I'm situating this inquiry as well in the context of the pandemic, which I think Ruth also did a great work in that space. But it's also important to flag that when we start looking at the case of elderly cult people in Australia, there's a kind of like shift towards the Asia-dominated cohort. And I'm building on the work of Bianca in here and her colleagues, really looking at how we might think about Australia as becoming Asia-dominated. And that strand is kind of like looking at the case of aging migrants as well. And I think we need to pay attention to that, especially now that, you know, Australia has a lot of programs when it comes to digital literacy programs. But again, it's also a question of how do we tailor these culturally informed and evidence-based interventions to ensure that we are actually connecting to the migrant communities, but also having the voices of the migrant communities in our space to think about interventions and programs. So in my research, I did interviews with 15 elderly people during 2020. And then in 2021, I did a follow-up interview of the 15 elderly people in 2020. And the age would be ranging from 60 to 92 years old, 9 females and 6 males, and 12 were retired, and then 3 were working, 6 lived with their family members, 4 lived with their partners, 4 live alone, and 1 live with non-family members, such as international students renting rooms. So it's very diverse, their arrangement, but also the age range of the participants. I would be showcasing later that it's important to think about how those arrangements could be shaping the digital media use and non-use of the platforms, but also the kind of like the age, you know, kind of like as you progress in terms of study and scholarly works, as you age, there are kind of like physical considerations that obviously must be considered with the use of technologies, and that could be affecting the physical capacity or cognition, affecting the use of technologies. And obviously, there were also use of visual-based platforms in shaping experiences of forced mobility, immobility, upon, you know, by the lockdowns, travel restrictions, curfews, and cross-border bans. So I'm using the word forced immobility because we were actually forced to stay put during the lockdown. We're not allowed to move around, and we're obviously limited with movements. Okay, so this is just an overview of the table that I created in terms of the participants' profile. So as you can see, in 2020, I did remote interviewing also in 2021 because we were in a lockdown. So I did around 9 interviews via phone call, and then 6 via Zoom. And then on 2021, I had 5 interviews via Zoom and then 5 interviews via phone call. So on a separate paper, I'm actually writing something about remote interviewing, which is fascinating because with that kind of like engagement with remote interviewing, it revealed something about the conditions of the migrants in their spaces, in their domestic spaces, which I'll be talking probably shortly probably someone would be asked a question and I would be happy to answer those questions. Okay, so the digital environment. So for the participants, majority were using, obviously had a smartphone, and we're using Facebook, Facebook Messenger, WhatsApp, and Zoom. Zoom was actually learned during the pandemic because the participants were missing that face-to-face interaction, which obviously happening in, for example, events, cultural gatherings, and even religious activities. So they're kind of like missing that. And even dancing and exercising together, it happened. It was happening before the pandemic, and they were missing that, so they were using Zoom in that space. So they were kind of like, in terms of literacy, some of them, they were taught by their family members, but then some of them had that kind of like a high level of literacy, and they're able to learn, use Zoom on their own and downloading it and using it. But obviously, there's a diversity in those practices. So like, for example, with this understanding of tech support, right? So for example, Rosa, she's 79 years old and she's born in Macedonia. So during the pandemic, she didn't know how to use Zoom, but the granddaughter actually taught her to use Zoom because they were having Zoom parties. So instead of like having, be excluding Rosa from that Zoom party, the granddaughter was actually visiting her and staying with her with the groceries, with the food and stuff. And she was Zooming with Rosa, with the family members elsewhere. So she was there to assist Rosa in using that because Rosa wasn't really that kind of like really know how to actually use Zoom in that space. So the granddaughter was teaching. But at the same time, before the pandemic, the family members were playing a role really in the use and purchasing of technology. For example, with Rosa, the granddaughter even researched a better smartphone for, for Rosa to kind of like use in that space. And obviously, for some people, like for example, with Maria, 65 years old, she's relying on her nephews and nieces to help her if there's something wrong with her phone. I remember when I was chatting with Maria over, I think that was a phone call. She was telling me if there's a problem with the computer, it's a nephew. If there's a problem with the modem, it's a niece. So she's very kind of like reliant on those individuals to help her in this space. I just want to flag that during the pandemic, some of the participants really struggled in getting services from companies. Like for example, I had a participant in 2020, she was struggling to fix the issue with her Mac, like with her Mac laptop, and then she was calling Optus, and then she was being directed to do this, do that, and all the instructions were in English, so she was struggling. I think this is an important point when you start thinking about culturally informed assistance to like older migrants. We have the services, right? But at the same time, those services were kind of like not tailored, particularly for individuals who might be struggling with the language, but also with technology. So there's a layering of that kind of like literacy that could be addressed when we start thinking about interventions. And then at the same time, there was an appreciation with the use of technologies during the lockdown because people were not allowed to, and the participants were very scared as well. Like we didn't have the vaccine yet in 2020, right? So the participants were, some of them were kind of like really scared to move around with the age risk factor, and kind of like just really appreciating how technology would be giving them the information that they need during that time. So for example, this was the case of Mohammed. So Mohammed was telling me like, I don't have to go outside and talk to my neighbors and get information, but I would just see everything on television, on the internet, and all of these technologies that can be used in that space. So Mohammed, by the way, is originally from Syria, and he was telling me that he was watching shows on the screen through the support of the children, setting up like YouTube videos, but at the same time looking at the internet through Google information in that space, and also Facebook for family members sharing in that environment. Okay, another important part of not only kind of like connecting in terms of for news information, but also personal consumption of things that would be culturally aligned. So this was the story of Anna. Anna is 65 years old and she's born from Malaysia. And she was telling me during the interview, you know what, Earvin, so obviously the daughter set up the iPad so she can access the YouTube on iPad. And whenever she's struggling with cooking, for example, with Malaysian dishes, or even any dish during the lockdown, she just going to YouTube and then watch the videos and then see how she might be able to improve her cooking. And for her, that's a kind of like support and making her happy that despite this kind of like constraints with cognition, the platform or the information online culturally connected to what she wants to do would be informing the way she'll be able to advance or even kind of like support that cognitive needs. And then obviously, there's also a connection locally. So we were disrupted, we were in a lockdown, and then some of the aging migrants, obviously we were asked to stay put, right? So, but some of the participants that I interviewed, they're talking about the importance of community support groups via Zoom. And this was the case of Lena. And Lena, she was with the husband during that time, and they were attending the program via Zoom on how to manage stroke, because the husband had stroke in 2016 and they're managing that, and they also want to learn what's happening and how to handle those situations wherein you had that kind of like condition. So it was very helpful that actually the husband saw the information on a newsletter, not online, in a newsletter, and then told Lena that, okay, we should access this, we should attend this event, and then they log into Zoom. You might be asking, how did they learn Zoom? So the children, the son, they're living with the son and the family. So the son was assisting them to set up Zoom and everything to ensure that they're able to connect in that space. So you can see this kind of like social relationship or family relationships shaping that enabling of virtual mobility. But more importantly, connecting transnationally for aging migrants. So these were some of the photos shared to me by Mohammed in 2020. actually, he asked me, Earvin, what's your WhatsApp number? And I was like, okay, do you want my WhatsApp number? Then I gave my WhatsApp number. And he was like, yeah, because I want to talk about the photos that I was taking during the lockdown. And I want to show you how great these photos are. Of course, I had the permission to use the photos in the presentation and also publication. And he was telling me, you know what, I have a garden, I cook delicious foods. And we have a group chat, a family group chat wherein he is based here with the wife and another son. One is based in Oman, one is based in Saudi Arabia, and one is in Germany. So they're very dispersed as a family, and they're not able to be together physically because of the lockdowns and obviously travel restrictions. So they're using the WhatsApp group chat, family group chat, to exchange those information. And these were some of the visuals that he was sharing that, in fact, he was telling me before, like, the reason why I'm also sending these photos to show them that I'm actually active. I'm active and I'm alive. So there's a sense of communication as a prompt or even like a gesture to demonstrate that these individuals are active, but also that sense of like, even we're in a certain time, I'm navigating this in this way. Like, for example, being busy and cooking and sharing all of this information. But also transnationally for family members supporting back home. Actually, I was reading the work of Bianca on care, on Baldassar and Billing on care as well, to just think about how care is performed through digital technologies, which I also do in my research. I think there's an important point where in here, we kind of like look at, for example, the case of Mercy. Even though she's already 62 years old, she's still working and she's supporting the family back home. The mother is 96 years old, still strong, but obviously there's a lot of care needed. So the family members back home are actually taking care of the mother in the Philippines. But for her, the care is performed through sending remittances, but also the constant calls. And they also have a group chat, family group chat, Facebook family group chat, wherein the family members back home will be sharing photos of, for example, the mother is doing in the Philippines, for example, having a nice haircut in this, for example, in this instance. So there's a kind of like care performance in that environment as well. And this is has been flagged by different scholars on how technologies are actually showing the performance of care among family members, especially in the context of a crisis or an uncertain time. Connecting transnationally is also important, wherein the migrants were connecting to their peers back home. For example, the case of Muhammad. So he's already retired. He's been here for how many years? He's a citizen, but he's connected with his networks from Saudi Arabia because they were in Saudi Arabia before they moved here. And they had this WhatsApp group wherein they exchange information about work, learning stuff. So all the things that kind of like being connected with peers transnationally. But at the same time, I just want to flag that although aging migrants were able to move virtually obviously virtually, and kind of like using technologies to connect locally to perform kind of like culturally informed practices or consuming contents for their own personal goals or something like that. There are also interruptions that I think that's important to highlight when we start talking about immobility. And this is a kind of like either voluntary or involuntary immobility in the digital space. And we need to start conversing about that, because when immobility is happening, it tells us about structural inequalities, it tells about the barriers, it tells us the broader picture of how the everyday living digital conditions of migrants are situated within regimes of control, of immobility, and mobility as well. So for example, the case of Maria, during the lockdown, she was living alone. So she didn't have the nephews and nieces who would be coming over to teach her. Before she can do that, she was doing that. But because of the lockdown, we're not allowed to visit anyone during 2020. So she struggled, especially not setting up the Zoom. But at the same time, in this quote, she couldn't follow the leader on Zoom because they were dancing, and it was frustrating for her. So we can see in here, perhaps she was also telling me that the screen was a bit small, so she couldn't see. So this is a kind of like tension in the digital space wherein you are immobilized in a digital environment, and this is triggered by forced immobility because you are forced to stop because of that constraint in that digital space. And during my interview, for example, with Rahul, he's 65 years old and born in India, the phone kept on ringing. And I was like, Rahul, would you want to answer the phone, the residential phone? And I was like, no, Earvin, I don't want to answer that. Oh, okay. And he started talking about me that phone call has been interrupting his life, and he calls it nuance because that's a scammer. scamming him almost every day, calling him that you need to pay this to do this. We were offering you this, you need to do this. And he already reported that scammer to the police, but the police didn't believe him because it was suggesting to just do not answer the phone. So this is a kind of like exclusion in that what we call safe digital environment, if you like, or mediated environment, wherein the migrant was forced to be in that destructive and uncomfortable environment because of the lack of support of that structural kind of like condition, but also the technology enabling that disruption in that space. So he was actually struggling in that environment. But also we met Mercy a while ago, was sending money to the Philippines for the mom. I was surprised that she was telling me that, you know, I don't use mobile applications for sending money because remittance, right? Talking about remittances as a form of care. And she was telling me, because you know what, I actually think that there are hackers who would be hacking the money that I worked hard for over the past years. So what she's doing, she's actually spreading her finances on different banks. And that's how she's sending it. And she's actually also going to a nearby remittance center to send the money. So that traditional form of sending money. So as we can see in here, although the digital environment is allowing us or inviting us to be able to have this smooth economic transactions, but for some aging migrants, that fear of, you know, like being hacked or being scammed would be excluding them in that transaction. And just to flag to everyone that there's also a report that's saying, like in Australia, like some people 55 age and above would be the victims of scamming and fraud. And we can see this kind of like vulnerability in the digital environment, wherein that literacy as well and the support should be in part of the conversation on intervention programs. And also, for example, with that negotiation of voluntary immobility, to not share information in recognition of the person's condition or the other family member's condition. And this was the case of Mali. She's originally from India, and she was telling me that, you know what, because we're talking about photos, sending photos to family members. So for her, they use Facebook Messenger to send what we call practical photos, wherein, for example, oh, I need your document, send it to me, and then I'll process it here in Australia, because the family members were thinking of visiting. But obviously, when it comes to, for example, the everyday mundane or intimate contents, like for example, photos of food, she was carefully curating the information to share to the family members. And she was telling me during the interview that, Earvin, I actually don't send photos of our food in Australia to my family members in Cambodia because I know they're already suffering and I don't want to look rich to them. So you can see this conversation, and this is happening during the pandemic. We see that, for example, in other countries impacted much by the pandemic, with job losses, with all of this kind of like information, kind of like constraints, travel restrictions. So, and Australia somehow was managing this pandemic in a way that's kind of like providing some support to people and to some communities, as opposed to other countries. So there was a kind of like recognition of that. And for Mali, there's a kind of like forced immobility to not share that content because of that understanding that people are already suffering in such environment. And also, we also met Ella in this case, wherein she's living at home alone. No one was supporting her in terms of technologies, but she's somehow adept in using technologies. But there was an issue with the laptop or the computer playing around with having constant updates, and she's not understanding how it's updating in that sense. So it's becoming kind of like, again, that term, a nuance for aging migrants because of the literacy and the lack of support to ensure that, to address that issue. And then obviously, connecting transnationally was quite evident for the participants with issues of material access. Like, for example, the case of Edwin from Indonesia. And he was telling me that, you know what, Earvin, I connect to my family members back home. I send money. We have this group chat, WhatsApp, but sometimes we also need to use video call, right? But sometimes it's a struggle because in Indonesia, the electricity might go off, and also the financial or the cost of the internet is still kind of like substantial back home. Like, for example, he has a family member Indonesia, they're supporting her. She doesn't have work, but it's also a struggle because the cost of the internet is an additional cost for that family member. And I think we need to think about the digital divide, just kind of like reflecting on this, connecting transnationally, but also locally, and also thinking about how we might map the rich and heterogeneous digital repertoires of the aging migrants during the pandemic. But obviously, digital media and online platforms were integral in the use of navigating during the lockdown 2020 and 2021. I didn't include the discussion on the QR code here, but I had those data. I had data on photos, on moving around, so we can discuss that shortly. And then it's important to think about the technologies and the practices rather would be shaped by social and technological forces. When I say social, that's the cultural, for example, the obligation to care, the kind of like gendered and familial dimension shaping practices, but also technological forces, the access to infrastructure, devices, and also the social technological element of the literacy and networks to use technologies in that environment. So as we can see in here, those who might have that network with them in the home during the lockdown, they're able to use technologies, they're able to be assisted with connecting. But sometimes, like some of the participants who were struggling living alone, they might be excluded because there's no one was actually assisting them. Or if there's a service to call, it's really a struggle because of the language, of the technical terms being used to convey how to use technologies. But also, I remember one participant was telling me, like, you know what, Earvin, I went to the shopping mall and there was a queue over there. And sometimes the queuing would be like, they don't care if you're an older person, you're trying to call them and you have to wait. One of my participants had to wait for more than 45 minutes just to get assistance with the phone. That's crucial for connecting with family members during the lockdown. Just imagine that exclusion created rather in that digital environment. And I think we need to think about that in that space. And I'm just flagging in some of my publications here if you want to read more of my research, of my data, and you can read my work in Communication, Culture, and Critique, and also Media International Australia. So thank you very much for listening. And I'm opening now, I think, the floor for a question and answer. And we can have a just really critical discussion on digital media use of aging migrants. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Earvin. That was a tour de force of the various issues I think that come up in the pandemic, but it certainly opens up several different lines of inquiry, which is really interesting and exciting to explore. So we do have some time now for Q&A. And if you have any questions, please now submit them through the chat function. Or if you would like to ask your question in person, you can turn on your camera and microphone and we will call on you in turn. So you have both of those options. So Earvin, I'll get you to stop sharing your screen so we can see everybody. Perfect, thank you. So while we're waiting for a few questions to come through, I'm going to take the chair's prerogative and ask some, but certainly encourage others to jump in. So Earvin, what really struck me listening to you talk was, I mean, I really like how you set up that tension between mobility and immobility. But I wonder if you might like to reflect a bit more critically on the role of class in that dynamic, because you kind of talked about it as people who are elites, you know, and those who are not. So, you know, the elites being those who could, I guess, you know, avail of Uber Eats and you know, all of those sort of proxy mobilities to get the services they need and sort of keep themselves safe. But actually, there was a group of people above that, and we rarely come into those in our lives, but they were all the ones who ran away on their yachts.
Yeah,
the Gold Coast. And you know that I just wonder if you might want to think a little bit more about those sorts of mobilities and immobilities in terms of class, but also perhaps if you want to reflect on it in terms of race and ethnicity, because from a state point of view, at the same time, you know, the discourse around who could enter into Australia during the pandemic was really interesting at different points in time. You know, everybody had to go to hotel quarantine. But then at one point when India was going through the Delta variant and was really raging through, COVID was raging through, you couldn't come back. Even if you were an Australian citizen from India, you'd go straight to jail. You wouldn't go to quarantine.
Yeah, that's right.
You know? Yeah. So I just wondered if you wanted to have some thoughts on those.
Yeah. So thank you very much, Bianca, for that. So I think the element of the class is important in thinking about research on aging migrants and digital media practices. And based on my research, I was kind of like looking at that as well in terms of like looking at how many aging migrants were still working at that time. So as I mentioned earlier, 9 of them were retired already. And in terms of retirement, some of them were relying to their family members in terms of financial, but some of them, they had previous jobs and they're able to get that financial support through their retirement benefits and stuff. But then I also had like 3 participants who were still working and they're supporting their family members back home. For example, one supporting family members in the Philippines, one is supporting family members in Sri Lanka, and then one is supporting family members in I think Indonesia. So 3 of them. So there was a kind of like interesting point in there. But I think what I noticed about class is this aspect of their backgrounds in terms of like when they moved to Australia. Like for example, Rosa, I was mentioning earlier, when she and the husband moved to Australia back, I think in the 1960s, they were working in the factory and she didn't know how to speak English. And she was telling me that she had this white paper, a piece of paper when in the basic English were written there, so she can communicate with some people in Australia. But because of that kind of like so she was working in the factory, and then eventually she had families, grandchildren, and now she's not working. But because of the limited income that she had in the past, but she has a house. But the husband, I think, passed away 2 years ago. She was telling me like, she's relying on the family members to support her financially, and the costing of the internet is covered in that support. So we can see in here how this not only the goods that you need, they need for their everyday lives, but also the cost to cover the internet in that space. And also for some of the participants with children working in the industry, they're supporting their family, the participant aging migrants, in terms of providing them also some medicines, covering health support, but also again the cost of the internet. But as I mentioned earlier, we met Muhammad, so he's Syrian, and he was telling me, you know what, Earvin, I get support from the government, that's 700 plus fortnight, and then I also have my wife getting 700 plus fortnight. And that's not enough for us to cover the rent. That's why sometimes, this is interesting, he was telling me, sometimes we don't use the internet because that's additional cost. And that's a form of exclusion related to class. And class now is not, I think we need to think about class as with this migration trajectory. Like what happened to that individual before and how is that accumulated with what's now, and what's with now with all of this reliance on digital technologies. It's a question of like who has the access and the finances actually to do that, and the network to do that. So that was striking for me. That's why Bianca, and for everyone here, when I was asking them, the participants, 3 of them told me, you know what, the government should somehow create this subsidized tech support. If we're buying phones, if we're buying internet, at least we're subsidized, at least half, to kind of like cover, or we pay half. And this is an interesting intervention because of that point that, you know what, Earvin, we are retired. And with another point, we don't want to rely to our family members because that's not good. And we can see this family relationship entangled in that element of class. So there's a feeling of a bit of shame to kind of like rely to family members because of that finances. And they're really struggling because they need that internet access, but they don't have the finances. So in relation to your second question, Bianca, on that kind of like race and ethnicity, I think in terms of the digital space, race and ethnicity was highlighted in terms of how the aging migrants were excluded in the digital platform. For example, when my participants were talking about getting, so one participant was part of this digital literacy program wherein they were receiving iPads from the government during the lockdown and to help them stay connected. But she was telling me, Earvin, you know what? I couldn't understand the instructions in English. I couldn't open the tablet because I don't know how. And when I called someone, they're also throwing me technical English terms. So that's a form of exclusion when you think about race in that environment, to not be able to think about who is the person using that technology and for what particular purpose. That's why actually majority of the participants, they were telling me, instead of going to a service from the government, service from a computer shop, family members, because family members are patient. They're telling me they're patient to teach us, and they're also there to use the language and to show them how to actually use the technology in that environment. So that's a form of I think, exclusion, and also the literacy of thinking about the technology as an alien for some of the participants. So one of my participants was telling me, like, she's very active in digital literacy programs, but she was also telling me that a lot of their members were not using the technology because it's considered as an alien. So they don't want to use it because of the language, the too small screen, and the platforms that they're using. It's not relating to them. And speaking of relating to them, the government of Australia should understand this relational perspective with technology use. Like, for example, you can't just run a program where everyone will be using Zoom. Because what if, like in Indonesia, they don't use Zoom because of too much consuming data, and they don't have the resource to use that, a platform. So they're using, for example, WhatsApp to have that conversation and sending photos to compensate for the visuals. So we need to think about that as well with race and transnational perspective.
Thanks. That's a great, very comprehensive answer. We've now got a question from Kirsten. Kirsten, over to you.
Hi, Earvin. Thanks. It's been a really interesting conversation. I think you've started answering my question, which was sort of around, if not government, like who, there's clearly an issue of trust with sort of technology and older people and ethnicity as another layer on top of that, I guess. But where do you think supports, or what sort of programs do you think are needed, and how do we roll these out in a sort of fairly major way?
Yeah, I think in terms of, like, I'll go back to your Kirsten thing with the concept of trust, because that's quite big during my conversation with the participants. So I actually noticed, also observed during my interviews, that they were trusting the government with the announcement of numbers via the news on television. So they're tracking the news, the numbers of infections. But in terms of health information, they get it from their community members. And some of my participants were saying that the translation of the government for health information on COVID for them wasn't really aligning and wasn't using plain language, and wasn't using their language properly. So that alone was actually making them decide that I won't access that information. I'd rather go to my networks. And also, some of them were translating the information from television or like the websites of the government to their community members. So there's a kind of like community mobilization in that environment. But also, I think with the trust, there's also a geopolitical element in that space. For example, one of my participants, I think she was from Taiwan, she was telling me, like, the Australian government, the communication, the information, they're quite boring, just stay at home, do this, do that. But when I was accessing the meme from my home country, it was fun, because there was a photo of this old man with showing off the bum, like a animated bum or something, and showing the tissue paper, and the tagline was like, you only have one bum, so you don't have to panic buy tissue paper. So again, that relatability to health information and communication, and that's transnational and also geopolitical in the sense of connecting back home. But she was also telling me that, the reason why probably Australia wasn't getting information from my home country because it's focused on this particular country. And she was telling me about China and that relationship with China. So you can see there's also a tension in that environment. But interventions, Good Things Foundation Australia has a lot of programs for digital literacy programs. So they're doing a lot of support for community members. But I think it's also important to bring in that mobilization, not only with the community members, but also to think about transnational connections and how's that shaping the digital media use. Because you can't just say technology is geographically bound. Migrants do connect back home. Like, for example, with scamming and fraud, connecting back home and to send money back home, that's an interesting pathway for scamming and fraud. If one of my participants was telling me, like, what, Earvin, sometimes I receive a call asking me to send money because my family was struck by this crisis back home. I haven't seen the crisis, but I'm ready to send money. I said, no, you should not send, you should verify first. So see that pathway of not seeing, but limited or probably limited view of what's happening there could be actually a trigger for that sense of issue. So I think mobilization from community members and more evidence-based kind of like study to think about digital media platforms and how the transnational is shaping that sense of connection. Because like Good Things Foundation Australia, they're talking about digital divide now, but they're also thinking about, but they connect back home. So what's happening? Like, for example, fake news. Fake news are not only happening in Australia, it's coming from overseas. And the migrants were talking about, oh, you know what, Earvin, my brother from this sent to me like this AstraZeneca can kill me. So I'm not taking that. Transnational. It's not only local, but it's transnational because they connect elsewhere. And that's an important part of intervention. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Great. Thanks, Kirsten. Thanks, Earvin. Any other questions and or comments from the audience? You perhaps rendered us speechless. Oh no, there's Ruth. Excellent.
Hi, Ruth.
Come on, sir.
Go ahead, Ruth.
Well, tour de force indeed. My goodness. Yeah, there's a lot to take in, but I was really interested in kind of the generational differences. When I think of my own parents, they seem to think that because something's published, even though they're smart people, they seem to think that it's true and it's accurate, you know. And I was interested in misinformation, disinformation, but also just the vulnerability of this age group with getting ripped off. So I was really interested in your comments there, Earvin. And thank you also for the shout out for the research that we did. One of the things that we found was that people didn't even, we only got to interview one person on Zoom, you know, so I was really impressed that you did so well, but it was in the early days of the pandemic. And now this is turning into a rant, but I was kind of, there's just so much I want to pick up on with what you said, but I just kind of wondered about whether there's some sort of simple things that I think, you know, there's a lot of really committed, keen, interested people that are listening to you today. Are there some simple things that we could all start kind of doing, whether it's in our homes, in our families, and in our communities, based on the work that you've done? There, I even made it quite short. You know, what can we all do next based on your research? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ruth. So I'll answer first the first question on that kind of like communication. I think that's an important part when we start looking at the circulation of information, especially during the pandemic. I mean, like that generational perspective. Like when I was talking to my participants, most of them were being taught by their family members, particularly their children. And that if the children wasn't available or they're not available, so it was the grandchildren who were assisting during that environment. But I think in terms of like that aspect of there's so much information, which do I actually believe is true? It's shaped by kinship or that relationship with family members. They tend to believe information shared by their family members. That's why they fall prey for misinformation or health issues. And especially if there's also a sense of trust. And these are individuals would probably have that less kind of like literacy on understanding animated contents, GIFs, or memes. In fact, during the interviews, one asked me, Earvin, how do you differentiate a meme, a GIF, and a fake news? I couldn't distinguish the three of them. And that's important because what if the government is sharing information on stay at home, but it's in a form of a meme? Then if a person sees a meme is a fake news, then that person won't trust that. So we need to be clear with the information that we're sharing. But at the same time, there's also a sense of those people with high level of literacy, they were policing their family members in group chats. For example, one of my participants saying, oh, you know what, Earvin, my sister from Queensland shared to me that, you know, AstraZeneca is no longer called AstraZeneca. And she was like, I actually told her that's incorrect because that's a hoax, that's misinformation. And then the sister listened because there's that relationship that I respect my sister. And we can see that kind of like relationship in that space. But also with generational information, the young people were also assisting the older adults to tell them that actually that's wrong, grandma, that's wrong. So do not share that. So there's also a sense of help. And then the participants I interviewed were telling me that that's a form of care because they care for my well-being to not fall into that environment. So going your second question, Ruth, it's a question of like, what do we do now with our research, right? So I think we need to think about the home now as a space where home is shaped by relationships of family members. operating locally, but also transnationally. I think we need to have a conversation of how do we start creating information or campaigns to address the home of migrants, and how do we tap into that intergenerational perspective? For example, let's talk about digital literacy. Am I targeting the young people in the home or the older adult in the home? And what types of hierarchies of use of technology should be considered in designing the platform? For example, young people are using TikTok, for example, in that space. The older adults might be using WhatsApp. Then we start thinking about, if we want to communicate, we target the home with the family members, but there's a kind of like intergenerational perspective that there are different technologies that can be used in that space. But also the language. We need to think about the language that we're talking to for older adults, and the types of content that we might be sharing for this particular environment. That's why I think, Ruth, your work on that kind of like co-design, culturally informed kind of like contents, that's important. And we need to unpack more of like the different generations on shaping the kind of like in content that they want to use in that environment. Yeah. Thank you, Ruth.
I'm furiously scribbling down notes.
But Bianca, you know, like the relationality and kinship thing's such a crucial kind of issue here. And I think about my parents who I've been teaching about technology, you know, and their kind of impulse to forward emails and WhatsApps, you know, and the relationship is with their peers, you know, who obviously don't get corrected enough by their children and grandchildren, you know, but yeah, I mean, I think there's so much work to do in our own sort of families and communities. So, you know, that was a great answer, Earvin. Thank you.
Yeah, Ruth, actually, that's also reminding me of...
Earvin, I have to cut you off. I'm so sorry.
No worries.
I'm very sorry. I feel bad
We'll just
to
have
do
a chat later.
because we're absolutely running out of time, and I feel so bad to cut you off, but I have to. But we will continue this conversation offline, but just in the interest of the audience, because it is 12:59 and counting, and we finish at 1. So I want to give everybody an opportunity, first of all, to please thank Earvin with your clap reactions, which is, I think you've definitely sparked off many conversations and ideas. And just for those, I know you've got other appointments to get to, let you know that our seminar next fortnight, 16th of August, will be the PhD student rapid fire session featuring short presentations from Ellen Gaffey, Ishani Mazumdar, Kerry Huang, and Joanne Trippier. So do join us then as well at 12 o'clock. For those who need to depart, thank you for attending our seminars in aging program. For those who would like to stay online and clearly capture and corral Earvin, you better get him around for a coffee soon. Please do so, and we can continue the conversation. Thank you, everyone.